You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, the last 7 years are the hottest on record, with 2021 one of the warmest ever. Scientists say politicians and the public must wake up to the threat from climate change. While extreme weather, from wildfires to floods, makes last year one of the most expensive for natural disasters. And is there a connection between green energy policy and political unrest? We'll discuss the challenge governments face creating a greener future as energy prices continue to rise. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. And we start tonight with the news that 2021 was one of the world's hottest ever years, with record highs of greenhouse gas emissions. Experts have described the findings of the latest research by the EU's Copernicus climate change service as another nail in the planetary coffin, warning that politicians and the public need to wake up to the urgency of climate change. The study found that the global average temperature last year was more than a degree higher than pre-industrial levels, and that the last 7 years were the world's warmest on record by a clear margin. Well, let's take a look at our data dashboard to set this into context. And this temperature rise that you can see here, 1.2 degrees and counting, is an estimate, and crucially, it's a global average of the rise above pre-industrial levels, and it doesn't take into account the differences in different regions. So let's take a look then at the findings of today's research in more detail. And this map shows areas which were hotter than the 1991 to 2020 average. And you can see that certain areas of the world were warmer than others. For example, large parts of North America. Now, Lytton in British Columbia recorded Canada's highest ever temperature in June, and that was 49.6 degrees. And in the Mediterranean, 48.8 degrees was recorded in Sicily. Now, that's a European record. But the European summer was hit by other extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. And you can see here that the devastating floods across France, Belgium and Germany were brought about by rainfall well above the 30-year average. Well, our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter joins me now. So, Hannah, how much of a wake-up call are these findings likely to be to governments around the world?
These big reports from influential bodies, in this instance the EU's climate change unit, do have an impact, and scientists increasingly abandoning all norms when it comes to use of language. You know, we've had one eminent scientist describe this report as a punch in the face. We've had others who've been responsible for the report saying that it's a nail in the coffin. You know, scientists are upping their language, trying to make movement happen. And the bit in that report that will have really worried them is that carbon dioxide and methane levels are now at record levels, when in fact they should be going in the other direction. And as you just outlined there, the impact of all of this is increasingly frequent, increasingly severe weather events, whether it be the wildfires in Turkey or the record heat and drought in the Pacific Northwest, or the devastating flooding in China or in New York City or in Europe, or the famine in Madagascar. We've reported on those from all over the planet over the past couple of years, but there's also the increasing likelihood now of the planet reaching tipping points or feedback loops that are very hard to predict and aren't very well understood. And that was all that COP26 was about, wasn't it? It was about uniting 197 nations, getting them to come together with concrete proposals for reducing carbon emissions, because they've got to get from 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere every year to net zero by 2050. That is what will limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we're creeping up there already, as you've just said. And as this report really outlines and hammers home, there are so many more challenges, and there are solutions right now. Governments all over the world struggling to come up with ways to decarbonise industry and transport and home heating and manufacturing and more, to get those emissions heading in the right direction and do the lion's share of that work within the next decade.
Hannah, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a look now at some of the day's other climate news. And in 2021, natural disasters such as hurricanes, wildfires and floods cost insurers $120 billion. Munich Re, the world's largest insurer, dubbed 2021 the second most costly year in history and warned extreme events are likely to become more common with climate change. A new Dutch government has been sworn in today with a promise to spend big on climate change. The coalition government has promised €35 billion, which is almost £30 billion, on climate measures. They include protection against rising sea levels in the Netherlands and building 2 new nuclear power stations. Producing and disposing of tyres has a monumental environmental impact. Research suggests more than 1 billion of them are disposed of worldwide each year. But as of today, plans to open the UK's greenest waste tyre recycling plant at the port of Sunderland have moved closer to reality. The Norwegian company Wastefront AS has announced that Technip Energies will be its engineering, procurement and construction partner for the build, which will convert end-of-life tyres into useful commodities.
So in a tire, you would have rubber that we transform into biofuels. You would have carbon black to ensure the durability of the tire, and we are simply recovering it as recovered carbon black into new tires. And you have wire to ensure the structure of the tire, which is simply recovered as scrap metal. So nothing is lost. The process is fully circular, and that's a huge breakthrough compared to the current solutions that are proposed for our used tires.
Now, we've seen in the last week the energy crisis cause scenes of violence and unrest on the streets of Kazakhstan. Lifting a price cap on liquefied petroleum gas used in vehicles and households saw the cost of the fuel double and triggered huge protests. Governments around the world are faced with the challenge of moving from fossil fuels to greener energy, which inevitably means reducing the subsidies which keep fuel prices down. So what can be done to help the public cope with the cost of the change? Well, joining us now is Mika Minyo-Paluelo, Climate and Industry Lead at the Trades Union Congress. Thanks so much for talking to us today. So protests in Kazakhstan sparked there by a rise in energy prices. To what extent is this global push towards greener energy playing a role in that price rise?
Thanks for having me. I'd actually argue that the problem is largely about the extent to which Kazakhstan has remained hooked on fossil fuels rather than the transition. The protest against the Kazakh petrostate regime was sparked by the global gas price rise that we've seen, whether in the UK or in Kazakhstan. Millions of people are now having to choose whether to heat their homes or to eat. And while at the same time ruling elites and corporations are walking away with billions of pounds, Kazakh gas is exported to China to produce consumer goods ultimately that we import. If instead we had deployed renewable energy at scale globally, publicly owned, 20 years ago, as the climate science told us to do, then we'd be much less susceptible to the volatile prices that we're seeing today. We wouldn't be you wouldn't see large populations slapped with this sudden impact, whether in Kazakhstan or here in the UK, we'd be in a much better place.
The new interim Prime Minister in Kazakhstan has ordered that subsidies are reinstated and actually extended to other fuels as well. Are there cautionary lessons, do you think, for other countries who are looking to lift fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, so it would make most sense to restructure subsidies so that they're paid to people directly effectively as a form of citizen income rather than being linked directly to the fuel. That way you can ensure that people, especially the people who need the money the most, are still receiving it, but it's not tied to the fuel. But also it's definitely important to remember that autocratic regimes that repress populations, that steal hundreds of millions of pounds and effectively are also propped up by extractive oil corporations, Exxon, etc., they will see mass popular protests. Maybe today, maybe next month. That happens around the world, whether it's in Kazakhstan, Egypt, Azerbaijan, or Algeria. It will keep happening. And when we talk about that safe and just climate future that we want to see, that has to be a democratic future too, built with the people, with trade unions, with citizen activists.
Well, yes, and we said that Kazakhstan's the first country to lose its government because of the energy crisis. Do you think it'll be the last?
No, and I mean we have seen governments fall in the past when we've seen rapid, dramatic price rises. This is an ongoing trend. Energy is a public good that people need for their lives. Like to live a comfortable life, even just a basic life, you need energy. When the price for that becomes extortionate and you can't manage anymore, then people go out into the streets. And we need to create a future where people can access their energy in an ongoing, secure, safe way, preferably through publicly owned enterprises. And that has to be built into the climate transition.
Mika Minho Paluelo, thanks very much indeed for your take on it. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Now, climate change is a serious danger in Jordan. The Middle Eastern country is one of the driest in the world, so needs innovative solutions in the quest to improve the water supply. In our latest climate diary, we hear from Mohammed Asfour, leading a project to increase the growth of native plants to help improve the quality and quantity of water available.
In Jordan, we depend on rainfall as the main source of our water supply. Treated wastewater is becoming an increasingly important resource. However, storing water underground over the long term will be far more sustainable and efficient than sole reliance on surface water storage that evaporates rapidly. We do this by planting native plants in areas which attract a lot of rainfall and by using micro-harvesting techniques to store the water underground. Our nurseries, such as this one, use an innovative approach that uses 1/3 of water compared to conventional methods. The local communities can be taught how to run and manage such nurseries, even without having any agricultural background. Native plants can then grow and thrive without much human intervention, contributing to cooling down the earth, improved air and water quality.
Now we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with artist and environmental activist Judy Ling Wong and director of the Conservative Environment Network, Sam Hall. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So first of all, much debate in recent weeks over how to deal with the cost of living crisis, which is set to get much worse soon when gas and electricity bills are set to rise. Now, this will hit consumers hard, of course, but business is also affected. And in a survey today, more than 1/3 of energy-intensive industries say they're thinking of postponing some of their net zero investment in order to pay for those rising energy costs. So Sam, to you first of all, a number of your Tory MP colleagues are worried that green levies on our fuel bills, which are designed, of course, to help finance the transition away from fossil fuels, are adding an unnecessary burden on people when their bills are already going up. Should those levies be paused, do you think, so that people don't have to choose between eating and heating their home?
Well, the first thing to say about this is that the main cause of the energy bill spike that we're seeing at the moment is the wholesale price of energy, in particular the wholesale cost of gas, which has increased by between 400 and 500% in Europe over the last year. That's not really something that the UK government can do anything about. It's to do with Vladimir Putin constraining gas supplies to Europe. It's to do with Asian economies demanding more gas and therefore there being more competition for liquefied national gas shipments. So that bit of it, there's not really much that the government can do in the short term. In terms of levies, I definitely do not think that we should be or could even pause some of those. For starters, a lot of the levies are underpinned by legally binding contracts, the contracts the government's entered in order to support investment in clean energy. But they also support a lot of jobs as well. The UK's world-leading offshore wind sector's built off the back of some of these contracts, and we wouldn't want to undermine them. But longer term, we know that the only solution to this crisis, which is based on our dependence on gas, is to get away from gas and to shift towards clean energy. And it's precisely this investment in clean energy which these levies support, which will get us there and which will make us less reliant on gas.
Judy, do you think this is the best way to pay for that transition, though? I mean, Centrica's CEO said recently, strip environmental and social levies out of energy bills and fund green programmes through general taxation. Do you think that could be a better route?
I think we need to think about all aspects of how we think about becoming greener. When people understand that certain things we have to pay more for in order not to damage the earth and have a better life, they're actually happy to pay more. It is about what it is and why the price rise is going. The other thing is about equity. We need to put into place frameworks that are fair in society. Recently, I've been actually thinking about a green minimum wage. For example, I have colleagues and so on who are not very poor, but they constantly complain about how they would like to be greener. They really want to be greener, but they just can't afford to do so. We need to begin to envisage a future for all of society in which we can all participate and pay for the things where we want it to be greener.
Interesting stuff. And Sam, we talk about the cost to consumers of their energy, but clearly cost to business is very high too, especially in these energy-intensive industries. And a third of them in the survey have talked about calling off some of their environmental investments to deal with the crisis. I know that Labour is talking about a contingency fund to support those struggling firms. Would you back that?
I mean, I certainly think the government should look at some short-term support for households and for business. And we just discussed there some of the levies. I think rather than pausing them or scrapping them off bills entirely, what the government could do instead is fund some of them out of general taxation. And I think that would, at least on a short-term basis, provide some relief to businesses and also on all households who are going to struggle with the cost of energy. And I think that sort of measure might well be better than that proposal you mentioned.
And Judy, do you think that people are ready to make sacrifices and lifestyle changes? You talked about how you discuss these issues with people. Do you think that people are changing and they are more open to it?
Well, right from the experience of COVID lockdown and so on, as you know, there's been a shift in attitude about how we look at life. Many people have developed an attitude of centering on the essentials, walking in nature, which is free, and having the pleasure of being with close family, colleagues, and communities. Their values are changing. And so, in a way, a lot of my middle-class friends actually said to me, we didn't go to theatre, we don't go to football, and so on. And in lockdown, there was money piling up in our bank, which made us realize we have lots of spare money besides the essentials. So in a way, they're also shifting towards, and this is something government might like to think about, a lot of middle-class people would be happier to pay more tax to have a better life rather than just lots of spare cash. Things are really changing in terms of how we look into this green future. And we need more information. I think the Daily Climate Show is very important because you give out lots of information that combines with aspiration to shift us towards better ways of behaving and thinking about where we put our money and what we want to be taxed for.
OK, I don't want to cut you off when you're being nice about the Daily Climate Show, but we really ought to move on to our next topic, which is about a Bill Gates-backed fund which is preparing to invest billions of dollars in clean tech projects such as direct air capture, green hydrogen and aviation fuel. Now, is this part of the solution? Private capital stepping in where institutions don't see immediate profit? Or would that money be better spent on the things that we know are important but are perhaps not as exciting, like improving public transport perhaps, or insulating our homes? So Sam, do you welcome this private investment into technological research? I mean, how much of a role should private capital be playing? Or really should it be the job of governments to fund developments that will benefit us all in the long run?
I mean, I think private capital has a huge role. I mean, we know that this transition to net zero globally is going to be very capital intensive. It's going to require lots of new infrastructure, lots of new techniques and forms of businesses, which will require investment. And it's too much, I think, for any government to fund and to finance exclusively. So the private sector's got a really key role. And so I absolutely welcome this fund. And I think, you're right to say that there are some easy, readily deployable deployable solutions which are available now, things like wind, solar, which have come down a lot in cost in recent decades. It's absolutely right that we keep deploying those at scale, but we do also need new technologies and cheaper technologies in some of the hard to decarbonise sectors like aviation, like the negative emissions. So that's where I think the real value of this fund will come from.
And technology, Judy, does have a big part to play in tackling climate change, doesn't it, potentially? But do you think the money is heading in the right direction? I mean, talking about aviation fuel, for example, do you think that's the right area that we should be focusing on at the moment?
I really want the massive amounts of money floating around going into things that are really fundamental to the center of people's lives. You know, talk about massive investment initiatives focusing on lowering green premiums on aviation does not appeal to me because it's not sustainable to encourage more flying. Some time ago, I heard that the jet-setting habits of Bill Gates and Paris Hilton mean that they produce an astonishing 10,000 times more carbon emissions from flying than an average person. I think we need to think differently about funding these things, such as green premiums. Maybe all first-class seats on the plane and landing fees for private jets at any airport should be massively expensive so that it covers all green premiums for everybody.
OK,
I don't think it's fair for, ordinary people to pay for it.
a quick reaction to that, Sam? What do you think?
I mean, I think that technology is essential in sectors like aviation, because we know that when you poll people about things they're willing to do in their own lives to tackle climate change, flying less, eating less meat and dairy, it's going to appeal to some people. Some people want to make those personal decisions for them to be more sustainable, but it doesn't appeal to a lot of people. And I think we need to instead design, develop, commercialize the technology which will enable people to keep doing those things, but in a sustainable zero carbon way. And so, I think we need to put in place the financing and the incentives to get those technologies to market.
OK, well, Sam Hall, Judy Ling Wong, we must leave it there, but thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. Well, tomorrow I'm going to be joined by co-founder of the Green New Deal UK, Fatima Ibrahim, and John Verdiek, the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy in the US. Thanks for watching. See you next time.